First, I want to thank the hosts of this event for the opportunity to discuss this important topic today. As Catherine mentioned, it was nearly 2 years ago that Mexico's ambassador to the OAS invited me to participate in the Permanent Council. Just like that day, in the years since, the OAS has continually refused to engage in any meaningful debate concerning its actions during Bolivia's 2019 electoral process. To cite just one example, after the New York Times reported on the findings of Francisco Rodriguez and his colleagues, which I'm sure we'll hear about much more, Secretary General Almagro responded with a 3,000-word press release denouncing the article as part of a coordinated disinformation campaign. Rather than respond to the substance of the article, the Secretary General criticized the newspaper's coverage of Stalin, the Holocaust, and Fidel Castro. It is unfortunate that OAS officials are not here with us today, because this discussion is important beyond just the events in Bolivia. The credibility and conduct of OAS electoral observation missions, of the Secretary General's office, and of the Electoral Department are fundamental for all member states. With election results increasingly being contested across the hemisphere, the value of a trusted and independent observer has never been higher. These observer delegations and other electoral missions are often conducted with the utmost rigor and professionalism. But when that is not the case, it is imperative to investigate and hold actors accountable. And this brings me to Bolivia's 2019 election. At around 7:45 p.m. on Sunday, October 20th, 2019, Bolivia's electoral authority, the TSE, provided preliminary results from its TREP system. With about 84% of the votes counted, Evo Morales had a nearly 8 percentage point advantage over his opponent, Carlos Mesa. The transmission of the preliminary results then stopped, though the much slower official vote count process did continue uninterrupted. Now that stoppage is obviously a key moment and something I will come back to later in the presentation. The next day, the TSE announced updated results with 95% of the vote counted. Morales' margin had grown to 10.15 percentage points, above the threshold for winning the election in the first round. Soon afterward, the OAS observation mission issued a press release denouncing a, quote, inexplicable change in the trend of the vote that, quote, drastically modifies the fate of the election and generates a loss of confidence in the electoral process. The next morning, we looked at the data ourselves, and we realized there was no basis for these OAS claims. In fact, when you controlled for geography, based on very simple arithmetic, the results were entirely explainable. We were able to predict, based only on the pre-interruption data, the eventual final results within a very, very small degree. Now that day I sent a message to a high-level OAS official involved in electoral observation missions. I explained this to them, and the response was, we know, but Morales never should have been running. This is to say that from the very beginning, we understood that this was not about fraud, but about the political will of the OAS. It was later reported that the U.S. representative to the OAS actually pressured and steered the observation mission to reach a determination of fraud. But that statement from the electoral mission was unusual for another reason. The fact that it failed to mention that the computo, the official result system, was already processing votes, and that the official results that had already been processed matched those from the preliminary results system. Rather than provide clarity in a tense and heated electoral moment, the OAS press release further fanned the flames. Though the OAS understood their statistical analysis was flawed, they continued to repeat the same allegations. This is more significant than a simple mistake. Now, in the many months since, further research has confirmed the flaws in this OAS statistical analysis, and it is great today that we can hear from two of those experts, and I will leave many of the technical details concerning this change in trend to their presentations. In the past, to the extent that the OAS has engaged in any debate regarding this issue, officials have simply said that its statistical analysis was nothing more than indicative, but that the work of the audit itself, conducted under the auspices of the Secretary General's office and of the Electoral Department, provides the real evidence of the fraud. But when we looked at the full audit, we found it to be just as flawed as the initial statistical analysis. The final audit, which was not completed until December, does note many real problems with the management of the election. But contrary to the assertions of OAS officials, it fails to provide any evidence that those irregularities altered the outcome of the election or were part of an actual attempt to do so. So I'll now take some time and go through the most significant findings from our research on this audit. And first, the report includes two pieces that it cites as evidence that apparently helped target the focus of the investigation. So these are things that they said, this is why we looked in these places. The first is that the OAS claimed that the final 5% of the vote was abnormally in favor of Evo Morales. But the data presented in the audit itself showed the exact opposite. It showed Morales' margin actually smaller in the last 5% compared to the 5% directly before it. Their own data contradicted their findings. Further, when the OAS did eventually release its data publicly a year later, we discovered that the statistician had sorted the data improperly. The second piece of evidence the OAS cites too is that in tally sheets, the records of the votes from each voting table across the country counted later in the official process, there was an abnormally high percentage with comments or corrections. But this should not have come as a surprise. During the preliminary vote count process, if a tally sheet has complex corrections or comments, it is placed aside to be handled later in the official count. So, the fact that these tally sheets came later may actually be evidence of the process working as it was supposed to. This is a common occurrence in elections throughout the hemisphere. So now moving to the actual substance of the allegations themselves that are contained in the audit. The first point I'd like to make is that the audit itself buries or conceals altogether the results of its verification exercises and fails to clearly explain its methodology. Because there are two result systems, the preliminary system and the official system, it is possible to compare the tally sheets in both systems as a check against fraud. The OAS auditors actually did this. After comparing the photos of tally sheets in the two systems, the auditors determined that the data matched in 99.8% of cases. But this key finding, which is a strong indication that there was no widespread manipulation, is only reported in a parenthetical aside 80 pages into the report. The OAS auditors also traveled to different departments to check the information contained online with the physical hard copies on the ground. The OAS analyzed about 900 tally sheets. However, it is not described how that sample was chosen. For an audit to be credible, it must work from clear standards and with clear methodology. Now, the only result presented from that verification analysis was that in 230 cases, the tally sheet had been burned. The audit says nothing about all of the other tally sheets it checked. Clearly, they found nothing suspect. If they had, surely it would have been in the report. This is a significant red flag. Verification is a key part of any audit. And while the OAS did perform a limited verification, they failed to report the results of it. In other words, the OAS buried or excluded key pieces of evidence that ran contrary to their findings of intentional manipulation of the vote. The next point concerns the OAS claim that identified 226 tally sheets that had been manipulated, and that those tally sheets were significant enough to change the results of the election. Quite simply, this is a lie, one that has been repeated on multiple occasions by high-level OAS officials in public forum. The audit reviewed a sample of nearly 5,000 tally sheets, all of which came from areas that voted overwhelmingly in favor of Morales. This bias sample is another methodological flaw in the report. From that analysis, the OAS identified these 226 tally sheets. Media reports and OAS officials have presented these tally sheets as containing altered results and forged signatures, and as proof that all of the IT problems and technical issues were part of a plot to alter the results of the election. What the actual audit states, however, is that the 226 tally sheets come from 86 voting centers where one person either completely or partially filled out part of the tally sheet. It is not that the signature of the poll workers were forged on these tally sheets, and it is not that one person filled out all 226 of these tally sheets. The allegation is that in 86 voting centers, one person wrote the names of the electoral jurors. Now, almost all of these tally sheets come from very rural areas and small voting centers. Rather than an indication of fraud or any deliberate manipulation of the results, this is likely indicative of a well-known phenomenon. In rural areas and smaller voting centers, it is not uncommon for one person to assist in the filling out of the technical information on a tally sheet. This may be especially true in communities with higher rates of illiteracy or where Spanish isn't the predominant language. The tally sheets are in Spanish. In fact, what we've heard consistently from folks on the ground who participate in the election is that oftentimes jurors will ask directly for assistance in this type of work from a notary who is legally part of the electoral infrastructure and is there to provide this type of assistance. Notaries cover about 8 tally sheets each. The OAS identified no cases where an individual filled out more than 7 tally sheets. Further, the final report does not provide any evidence indicating that these perceived irregularities affected the outcome of the vote. The final report does not provide any analysis of the results of those 226 tally sheets in comparison to the other tally sheets from the same voting centers that the OAS analyzed. If the 226 tally sheets were forged or part of some systematic attempt to manipulate the results of the election, as the audit claims, one would expect the actual results on those tally sheets to look substantially different from those from the same voting centers that the OAS said were fine. This is not the case. In fact, the votes on the irregular tally sheets match almost exactly the votes on the normal tally sheets. This shows very clearly that, even if there were some irregularities, they had no impact on the results of the election themselves. And the results from last year's election in Bolivia further confirm this. In 2020, the MAS candidate did even better in just about every single one of these voting centers with suspect tally sheets. There is simply nothing inherently wrong or abnormal about a party receiving more than 90% of the vote in certain parts of the country. And finally, I'll discuss the stoppage of the TREP preliminary results system on the day of the vote and the concerns over these supposed hidden servers that have been much cited. Now, certainly the failure of the TSE to provide a clear public explanation for its decision contributed greatly to the crisis and damaged the election's credibility. Yet the audit fails to provide essential contextual information that could help explain the stoppage itself and restore some sense of credibility to the process. Whereas the final report could have provided clarity around these key events, the report's authors instead opted to obscure and manipulate the public record. At 7:30 p.m. on election day, which is to say just minutes before the TREP stoppage, the private contractor hired to audit the electoral system, Ethical Hacking, sent a maximum alert to the TSE. The company noted that a server outside of the plan schematics was transmitting data into the results system. The OAS audit never once mentions this alert even being made. What is more, the OAS audit never mentions that while the TREP had been stopped, this company, Ethical Hacking, was actually provided access to the server in question and produced a report determining that nothing had been altered and nothing was wrong. Now, the server itself was managed by another private contractor, Neotech. And the audit does also not mention that when this happened, officials actually accused Neotech of committing fraud against the MAS candidate. Now, whether a coincidence or not, the stoppage occurred directly after a large influx of vote from pro-Mesa areas of the country, which appeared to temporarily decrease the margin of Evo Morales. Now, once the TREP restarted the following day, another outside server was identified. The OAS claims this is yet again evidence of manipulation. But it makes perfect sense that, after all of the problems with the TREP on election day, the concerns over fraud on both times, that the TSE would want to configure a fresh server to handle the rest of the count. Now, the OAS claims that it was set up with no oversight, but again, its own audit contradicts this. As a report included as an annex to the audit notes, the new server was configured in the presence of both the audit company and the other private contractor responsible for managing the electoral system. The OAS then claims that this new server was being directly controlled by some unnamed advisor. Once again, this is false. The server was under the control of Neotech, and the documents in the OAS audit actually show this quite clearly. Now, there is another inherent problem with the OAS audit's findings. The majority of its findings relate to this preliminary TREP system. And the OAS claims that the stoppage of this preliminary system on the day of the vote was part of an effort to intentionally manipulate the results. At the same time, the audit identifies a series of technical issues with the TREP system itself. If the system was flawed, as the OAS says, then stopping it was surely the right decision. And what the OAS leaves out is that the day after the vote, it was the OAS observer mission that pressured the TSE to restart the TREP, a decision that the TSE is then condemned for. This is simply ridiculous. And finally, it needs to be noted that in 2020, during the last election, there was a new preliminary results system. But government officials decided to scrap it altogether the night before the vote. The OAS response to this was fine. It was a preliminary and non-binding system, and so it had no impact. Yet it's the preliminary system that makes up the majority of the OAS findings in relation to the problems in the 2019 election. So just to wrap up, the record here is clear. From the initial press release the day after the vote to the final audit, the OAS conduct in relation to Bolivia's 2019 elections constituted a clear political intervention, one that was based on flawed statistics and a misrepresentation of even their own findings. Most importantly, this political intervention had very real and very deadly repercussions, as Catherine noted in her opening remarks. But it is not too late for OAS member states to ensure accountability and to begin repairing the institution's much damaged credibility. Thank you.